Israel was a useful ally to the United States in its invasion of Afghanistan, toppling of Saddam Hussein, and the Cold War. In the present, they are not a key strategic partner. That's a provocative position, but one that geopolitical analyst Jacob Shapiro feels pretty confident in.
It's surprising to me that it's provocative because of how self-evident it is to me as an analyst, but fine, let's provoke if people think that that relationship is still some kind of special relationship that is supposed to be eternal. It's not. And I would just point out some basic history here. If you go back to the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, the United States was not Israel's top ally at the time. It was France. And from 1948 until roughly 1967, France in some ways is Israel's most important strategic ally. The reason that Israel has nuclear weapons is because the French gave them nuclear technology, probably in the 50s and 60s. The Sinai campaign, where the French and the British conspire with Israel to take over the Suez Canal because Nasser is rising in Egypt. It's Dwight Eisenhower's administration that comes in and says, Israel, go home, and slaps Britain and France on the wrist. The Israel-U.S. relationship is forged for real in 67 and 73, those two big Israeli-Arab wars, and then beyond. And it's really a Cold War relationship because you do have the rise of Arab nationalism in places like Egypt and Syria, and all these places align with the Soviet Union. And so the U.S. counter-response to that is to have alliances with Israel, to have an alliance with Turkey. That's why Turkey is in NATO. And then also Iran was part of that alliance network. That, of course, blew up in 79. And the way that the United States managed the Iranian alliance is part of the reason that the Islamic Revolution happened there. We can go down that road if you want to talk about it. But basically, like the Israel-U.S. relationship, it was that Cold War relationship. Israel was incredibly useful as a balancing force against these Arab powers that aligned themselves with the Soviet Union. The day the Soviet Union falls, the strategic logic of the U.S.-Israel relationship takes a major hit. It doesn't go away completely because the U.S. still has major dependencies on the region, especially on Saudi Arabia for oil. So the more you can build a stable balance of power and have countries that you are aligned with in the region so that you can shape foreign policy in the region, even after the Soviet menace has gone away, is good. But then you get the 2008 shale revolution. And so now we're no longer talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship. We're also talking about the United States doesn't have to import a barrel of oil from the Middle East if it doesn't want to. It can if it wants to make the Saudis happy or if it wants to make the Emiratis happy. But because of shale, like the United States is completely self-sufficient and it can go to other markets if it wants to fill in the gaps there. The United States has so much energy that it can support Europe when Russia has invaded Ukraine and Europe has gotten cut off from natural gas. So we're just pumping out LNG exports and literally keeping the lights on in Europe while energy prices in the U.S. are still relatively, to everybody else in the world, comparably low. All of which is to say the United States doesn't really have a strategic interest in the Middle East. And certainly that relationship with Israel, what is the United States getting out of that relationship with Israel right now? What existential national security threats is Israel actually providing the United States going forward? Not a whole heck of a lot. And not only that, Israel is sort of spitting in the United States' face, expecting that the United States is going to be there for them no matter what. And yet Netanyahu comes out and claims that Biden's not sending him the weapons that he needs, even though Biden has sent him most of the weapons that he needs and has experienced significant political hurt because he's been very pro-Israel while his party has sort of been a little bit more on the fence. So I'm happy to dive into any of that history if you want. But the really, really broad strokes here is that, the U.S.-Israel relationship is not some special relationship. It's not like they've been bosom buddies the entire time that Israel has existed. It was born of the combination of the Cold War and of U.S. energy dependence on the Middle East. And the Cold War is over, and the U.S. is not dependent on the Middle East for energy anymore. So we've been talking about the pivot to Asia since, Clinton was Secretary of State. That's where U.S. strategic interests lie. Now, there's inertia, and there's bureaucracy, and there's all sorts of other things that keep things going the way that they are. But if you're just doing the cold, hard, geopolitical, strategic logic, it's very, very hard to divine how Israel is that important to the United States going forward.
So in that spirit of the cold, hard geostrategic logic, how is it so relevant to France? Is that about balancing the Mediterranean? Like, what is the perspective from a French footing that makes that so geopolitically significant?
Well, not anymore, but it was significant in the 40s and 50s when France and Britain were supporting Israel in some of its various endeavors because these were declining empires. Number two, had significant colonial possessions in the Middle East that they were losing as a result of states going independent and rising nationalism and things like that. and were incredibly dependent on, in fact, had built their energy strategies around access to these countries. So when Gamal Abdel Nasser is a rising force in Egypt and is threatening to shut down the Suez, first of all, the British thought the Suez was their own. They felt like they owned it. So it was already sort of an insult to them. But it was also, if Egypt can close off the Suez, it can close off all of that Middle Eastern oil that France and Britain had been depending on to those markets. And these were countries that were used to being imperial great powers. So they weren't going to accept that. They were going to go open up the Suez and open up the markets and take their oil back. So that was the reason that Britain and France, post-48, I should say. It's not like they were helping Israel during its War of Independence in 1948. But that was the sort of strategic logic behind what France and Britain were doing then. In 48, I mean, both the United States and the Soviet Union approved the creation of Israel at the UN, so they don't stand in the way there. But the reason that Israel survives in 48, it's a combination of three things. The first is that the Arab armies just couldn't communicate with each other. So if you would put all of their force together, they were, in terms of numbers, everything else, they far outclassed the nascent Israeli state. But you had Egypt and Syria and Jordan and even some Iraq in there. None of these forces were communicating well with each other. And the Jordanians were the only ones that were really well trained. The British had trained them. So you didn't really have good training there. The second was that Israel's size actually worked in its advantage. They had really, really short interior lines. So Israel could take its best troops, punch the Egyptians in the mouth, then rotate the troops over to the Jordanian side, punch them in the mouth, move back and forth. Whereas those Arab armies were going across vast distances to try and attack Israel. But the third is that the Israelis were getting black market weapons from what was then Czechoslovakia via the Soviet Union. And I think about that often because when you think about the Russia-Ukraine war, where is Ukraine sourcing a lot of their weapons? It's still like the Czech Republic and the Slovaks and the arms merchants and all the stuff that's there in general. That's how Israel survived too. So all of which is to say, in 48, it's not France, it's not Britain, it's not the United States, it's not the Soviet Union. It's a combination of Arab incompetence and getting black market weapons from the Soviet Union via Czechoslovakia that allows Israel to survive. So I guess it's provocative because people think that just because something is true now, it's always been true. And we should say Israel has every strategic interest in making sure the United States is close to it. So Israel wants to make that relationship as close and as sticky as possible and as painful as possible for the United States to end it because it needs that security guarantor. So maybe that's part of the reason behind it. But again, that if we're here in the year of our Lord, 2024, the strategic logic that bound those two countries together is not there. And that should really be a warning signal, I think, for Israeli leaders, because eventually the United States will wake up to that reality.
In that maybe, present to 5 years forward time horizon, one of the ideas that I've seen put forth is this idea of balancing, the Middle Eastern region. And there kind of being these potential three poles, and maybe the kind of thesis of something like the Abraham Accords was you could put the Saudis and Israel together. You then have Iran, and then you could have Turkey. And they're, by having those kind of 3 points of the triangle, so to speak, there wouldn't be a singular power that dominates the region that completely, maybe not monopolizes necessarily, but overpowers in the way that, China may threaten to overpower the entire Eastern Hemisphere or East Asia. So do you buy that framing? Or are you skeptical of that kind of being at least what the optimal outcome is for outside parties that just kind of would prefer to see a region be more stable?
The ironic thing here is that the United States blew up a balance of power that was functioning fairly well. So when the United States invaded Iraq and destroyed the Iraqi state, and for good reasons, I have no love for Saddam Hussein. The world is a better place probably without Saddam Hussein doing whatever he was doing in Baghdad. But Iraq was holding Iran back. So Iran really couldn't project influence out to the Mediterranean because Iraq was its nemesis and was blocking it from doing all of those things. So when the United States fails in Iraq, it really opens the door for Iran to become a much more disruptive power in the Middle East. And in some ways, everything the United States has done in the region since George Bush had the mission accomplished banner on the aircraft carrier is about trying to fix that. They're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together. And they're struggling because you can't, because Iran is out. And unless you build a solid Iraqi state to block them, that is not going to be friendly with them, it's not going to work. And Iraq is majority Shiite, so there's going to be some relation. I don't think it's three poles. When I think about the Middle East, there's really 4 countries you have to think about. You've already named 3 of them. So Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran. Egypt is the other big one. Egypt has geopolitical challenges that we can talk about, but those are sort of the 4 national poles. But I think it's also difficult to think in terms of nations here, in terms of the power centers, because there's Shiite Persians, and there's Shiite Arabs, and there's Sunni Arabs, and then there's Turk, and then there's Kurds that are sitting in there that don't have a state for themselves. You start, bopping around, it's actually a lot more complex than the national landscape would make you think. And that, again, if you want to blame anyone for what's going on in Israel, Palestine, in Iran, in any of these places, blame the Europeans. They're the ones who drew these ridiculous, border lines that have nothing to do with reality. And now we're dealing with the consequences of those other sorts of things. I think the logic behind the Abraham Accords was Iran is a problem, Turkey is a problem. Our best balancer against that is a combination of Israeli technology and capital with Sunni Arabs. So not just with the Saudis, but with Sunni Arabs in general. So that's the population and military resources of Egypt, that's Jordan, both of which have peace treaties with Israel brokered by the United States. Let's add in that Gulf money. So the Gulf countries don't have really armies of their own that you would respect in a battle, but they do have tons of money, new equipment. They've been buying weapons for decades. Put that together. Now we have an Arab-Israeli bloc that is going to push back against Iran, is going to push back against Turkey. That, I think, is the logic behind it. I thought at the time that it was a mistake, and I still think it's a mistake because I think those are the two. I think Sunni Arab as a category has its own internal divisions. You're never going to be able to unite them and keep them united, and you're certainly not going to be able to keep them united with the Israelis. Just look at what's happening in Gaza and the problems that that's causing between Sunni Arab states and Israel in general. If you look back over history, time and time again, it's powers based around what is today present-day Istanbul and powers based around ancient Persia. Those are the big powers in the Middle East. And usually it's sort of a battle between those two zones for who gets to be the person on top. And maybe there's the balance of power right there. Maybe it's Turkey versus Iran is the long-term balance that we're thinking about in general. And the problem is that between Turkey and Iran right now, you have this sandwich of, ISIS terrorists and some, sclerotic old authoritarian states, and in Israel that's moving in the wrong direction, and Kurds who don't have a state. There's all this stuff in between them, and maybe those powers will use all of those different pawns on the chessboard against each other. But I think in the long run, it's going to be Turkey and Iran. And I think the problem with the Abraham Accords, because remember, the Abraham Accords is also coupled with the end of the Iranian nuclear deal, and that, I think, is the problem. You're not going to contain Iran. You cannot go back and create some kind of bulwark against Iran. You destroyed it when you destroyed the Saddam Hussein regime. Accept it, and accept that you are going to have to deal with Iran on something of a pragmatic basis, and also accept that there are some things that the United States has in common with Iran. You know what is an existential threat for Iran? Radical Sunni Islamic terrorists. That is a direct threat to the future of Iran. You know who doesn't like radical Sunni Islamist terrorists? Everybody in the West. One of the reasons ISIS fell when it did was because for a year or two there, the West and Iran were like, all right, let's work together to get rid of ISIS because these guys are the real bad guys. So for me, the Abraham Accords were kind of short-sighted, and it was betting on the wrong horses, both in terms of who's going to be able to block these different powers and who are the main powers in general.
If you were to think about those two, you talk about Turkey and Iran balancing each other, is there one that you would bet? Is there one that you think has better footing and more of the pieces in place to win the region in that context?
Absolutely. Turkey is winning. And Turkey is winning in part because, led by the United States, the West has decided that Iran is the bigger threat and has been isolating Iran's economy and grinding Iran's economy to its knees. Go back and look at a chart of GDP of Turkey and Iran starting roughly in the 1980s. Iran is a much bigger economy back then, and it's basically inverted in the last 30 years. So now Turkey is a much bigger economy, so much so that Turkey is, taking market share from European car makers, is making all sorts of things that you need. I had to order a replacement freezer a year or two ago. It took a while to get to me because the chips that were put in the freezer were being made in Turkey, not in China anymore. Turkey is coming in a meaningful way. Turkey's also building military bases throughout the Horn of Africa, expanding into the Balkans, some of their old stomping grounds. Turkey is a rising power, but because they're in NATO and because they have these old relationships, nobody really gives Turkey that much of a problem. Whereas Iran, which is the natural balancing act to Turkey in the region, can't balance it because its economy is terrible. its politics is in disarray, and it's isolated by all of these different Western countries. So if you're thinking for the long term, both if you're Israel or if you're the West, you have to think about how do you, because you don't want to like let this particular regime in Iran just come in from the cold. Like again, like it's a thuggish, theocratic, authoritarian state. It does all sorts of nefarious and malign things throughout the region and throughout the world. The fear of nuclear proliferation, all of that is completely legitimate. But the exact wrong thing to do is to isolate them into a corner so that they want to ally with China and Russia. Meanwhile, Turkey is slowly expanding out into the Middle East. And I do think, you know, we've seen this with the supreme leader in Iran is ailing. And I think there's probably some internal fighting that's going to happen in Iran around the leadership transition. Even like the fact that Iran was open to the Iran nuclear deal told you that the economy was so bad that they were willing to do some things to try and engage with the West again. So it's a delicate balancing act. But I would say here today, if you extrapolate from current trends, Turkey is going to be the dominant power in the region. And for countries like the United States or even like Israel, that's probably not a good thing. What you want is a balancing act. And the lesson to learn from Iraq is don't cut the knees out from underneath the powers in the region that are supposed to balance against each other just because you don't like the regimes. You work with plenty of regimes you don't like. You like the Saudi regime? Nobody likes the Saudi regime. So figure out how to work with some of these countries and accept that your existential interests just aren't there anymore. So it doesn't really matter what the ideology is. Your interests are ultimately going to determine what is good policy.